Gunk holing. One of the problems with gunk holing is that many boaters don't know what it is. I have just taken a scientific survey of 4 boaters, and none of them knew the meaning of the word gunk holing. They did make several guesses, all of which were wrong and pretty weird to boot. It's a good thing for them that I'm not a Freudian psychologist, or they would be in a lot of trouble right now. Even my unabridged Random House Dictionary of the English Language contains gunk hole, which it defines as a quiet anchorage, as in a cove. It defines gunk holing as to sail casually along a coast, anchoring from time to time in quiet coves and inlets. If a simple lexicographer knows the meaning of gunk holing, you would certainly expect boaters to, since they're the ones who do it. All right, I'll confess. I was past puberty before I knew a gunk hole from a gopher hole. About 20 years past puberty. But so what? I didn't bring the subject up. An editor did. He wrote me a letter requesting that I write an article on gunk holing. I'm pretty sure you know what it means, he wrote evasively. But don't bother looking in your Webster's dictionary because it isn't in there. Well, of course it wouldn't be in that dictionary. Webster wasn't the sort of man who would know about gunk holing and wouldn't admit it if he did. Now that I've taken care of the definition of gunk holing, I had better tell you how it's done properly. There's a lot of slipshod gunk holing going on among boaters nowadays, which is probably another one of those signs of the times we're always hearing about. People just don't want to take the time to learn how to do a thing properly, the way God intended. Do I think God approves of gunk holing? Why, of course I do. He approves of all the good things, and gunk holing is one of the good things. When you stop and think about it, the Garden of Eden was sort of one great big gunk hole, with Adam and Eve laid back, taking it easy, and not a worry in the garden. Then Eve got hungry. What ruins a lot of fine gunk holing is somebody's getting hungry. That's when all the trouble usually starts. Let me give you one example. My friend Wretch Sweeney and I were fishing up on Lake Roosevelt one day a couple of summers ago, and all the fish had fallen into a comatose state and sunk to the bottom, as they like to do when I'm in the vicinity. Then a rare and startling thing happened. Wretch got an idea. "Hey, I got an idea," he said, appearing no less amazed than myself. "Let's find us a nice gunk hole and tie up to a tree for the rest of the afternoon. We can lay back and take it easy until the evening feed." I knew we weren't properly prepared for serious gunk holing, but since this was Wretch's first idea in several months, it seemed a shame to waste it. "That's a good idea," I said. "Let's do it." It took us nearly an hour to find a halfway decent gunk hole, one with some shade on the water and an aesthetically pleasing backdrop of trees and moss-covered rocks, and a tiny stream tumbling melodiously down a picturesque precipice. There was one drawback. 100 yards above us, a highway wound around the mountain, and the roar of traffic drifted down to our otherwise peaceful gunk hole. Worse yet, there was a roadhouse up there, and we could hear the banging of the screen door, the raucous voices of the clientele coming and going, and occasionally even the sound of glasses and plates knocking together. "Kind of noisy for proper gunk holing," I said. "Yeah," Wretch said. "Just have to ignore it, I guess." We spread out the boat cushions and lay down on them. The boat rocked gently in the waves, a bird twittered, the water made appropriate water sounds against the shore. Presently, Wretch said, "This is nice, ain't it?" Yes, I said. A man needs gunk holing from time to time. You know what I mean? Yeah. Then Wretch said from beneath the hat over his face, they're cooking hamburgers up in that roadhouse. I can smell them. You're probably just spelling that hat. No, it's hamburgers. Big, fat, juicy hamburgers. A period of silence. We got anything left to eat in the lunchbox? Wretch asked. Just half a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Ugh. A period of silence. Wretch suddenly sat up. They got thick slabs of sweet onion on those big, fat, juicy hamburgers. Now don't tell me you can't smell that onion. No, I don't. That roadhouse is 100 yards away, up on top of that cliff. You're just imagining you're smelling big, fat, juicy hamburgers with thick slabs of sweet onion on them. Now, are we going to gunk hole or not? Wretch lurched to his feet and stared at the cliff. Probably won't take more than 10 minutes to climb up to that roadhouse. Are you crazy, man? I said. A person could kill himself trying to climb up that cliff. Wretch's nose twitched, as if savoring the aroma of a big, fat, juicy hamburger with a thick slab of sweet onion on it. I gotta try, he croaked, stepping out of the boat and heading for the roadhouse. Unfortunately, the boat was in 15 feet of water. He shot out of sight in a giant splash, only to emerge a minute later, scrambling over the moss-covered rocks like a frightened crab. He slipped on the wet moss and fell into the melodious stream, cursing both roundly. Scarcely had I recovered from a fit of mirth over this spectacle when I saw his hulking figure clawing its way up the side of the cliff. Wretch hung by one hand from a tiny bump in the cliff, while his legs churned against the rock in search of a foothold. A short while later, he seemed to be clamped to the granite wall with nothing but his fingernails. What worried me was that he hadn't got to the bad part of the cliff yet. Eventually, he threw a leg up over the lip of the cliff and vanished. I heaved a sigh of disgust and flopped back down on boat cushions, trying to recapture some of the passive enjoyment of gungle. Scarcely had I closed my eyes, however, when I heard a little shower of rocks rattling down the cliff. I glanced up, and there was Wretch again, clawing his way back down. 20 minutes later, he was back at the boat. You ought to see those hamburgers. They are magnificent. So, why aren't you up there eating one of them? I asked. Forgot my billfold. It's in my tackle box. Get it for me, Choke, will ya? I tossed him his billfold, and he staggered off again in the direction of the cliff. His ascent this time was so horrifying and verbally obscene that I will not describe it, in case this is being read by children. 2 hours later, while I was napping peacefully in the boat, I was suddenly attacked by a tattered, wild-eyed creature that came lurching out of the brush on shore. Snatching up an oar, I attempted to repel the beast, only to discover at the last moment that it was Wretch Sweeney himself, or at least what was left of him. I hauled him onto the boat. I've had enough gunk holing, I told him. The fish have regained consciousness and are starting to feed. Now that we've had a good rest, we should be able to get in a couple of hours of hard fishing before dark. Wretch replied in a tone that suggested a definite lack of enthusiasm. I tried to cheer him up. Nothing like a little restful gunk holing to get the old juices flowing. Humph, he said, rather crossly. Well, I went on cheerily, how was the big, fat, juicy hamburger? Can you honestly say that it was worth all the risk and effort and the trouble? Yeah, it was. Really? Best burger I ever ate. It was charbroiled, but juicy pink on the inside. The buns were homemade and toasted on the grill. Then they were slathered with this special sauce. Next, thick slices of tomato and cheese were loaded on. Tomato too? Yeah, and nice, fresh, crisp lettuce. Next came this big slab of Walla Walla sweet onion. Oh, it was enough to drive a hungry gunk holder out of his mind. Good onion, huh? Delicious, scrumptious. Then they heaped on the side this huge pile of steaming hot, thick, crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside French fries. Oh man, let me tell you, was that ever a good burger? Well, Wretch, I said, shaking my head, after you risked life and limb climbing that cliff for a hamburger, let me ask you this. What? When you reach that overhang at the top of the cliff, do you think it's easier to throw your right leg over it first or your left? That is a classic example of improper gunk holing. Here now are the rules for proper gunk holing. 1. Take plenty of food and beverage, since gunk holing stimulates a ravenous appetite. A good supply of edibles will usually discourage members of the party from going ashore to forage at roadhouses, farmhouses, and campground garbage cans. 2. If your spouse is along, do not allow her to persuade you to disembark for the purpose of picking up a nice piece of driftwood, collecting a strange weed, or obtaining an unusual rock for the rock garden at home. My wife once talked me into going out into a waterfront cow pasture to commit theft on a rock shaped vaguely like a wash basin. Although it was shaped like a wash basin, it weighed approximately the same as a bathtub, filled and with a fat lady in it. No sooner had I wrenched the rock loose from the earth in which it had been embedded by the last glacier to pass through, than the herd of cows resident in the pasture raised a cry of alarm and took off after me in a frenzy to thwart the burglary. I sprinted for the safety of the boat, all the while mindful of how ridiculous it appears for a man to sprint with his legs bowed out in the configuration of a barrel hoop and his arms stretched practically to the ground from the weight of a monstrous boulder. Naturally, my wife started screaming. "Don't drop the rock!" she screamed. "Don't drop the rock!" Never be persuaded to go ashore while gunk holing. 3. Gunk hole only with persons who don't tell jokes. Nothing ruins gunk holing faster than a compulsive joke teller. You will be pulling into a peaceful cove where the foliage of the shoreline is mirrored in the water. The stillness of the place is broken only by the distant call of a loon. A doe and her fawn are slipping out of the shadows for a drink. The hillside above is golden in the sunlight and sprinkled with wildflowers. Then your companion will blurt out, "Say, did I ever tell you the one about the farmer's daughter and the Russian cosmonaut?" Well, it seems there is one sure cure for the compulsive joke teller while gunk holing, but I can tell you only that it involves an anchor and a length of rope. 4. Don't gunk hole at night with an attractive person of the opposite sex, particularly when golden moonbeams dance on undulating waves. A gentle breeze whispers sweet nothings to the stars, and mingled fragrances of pine and cedar caress each breath of air, unless, of course, you have a serious relationship with the person, and then it's okay. There are many other rules to proper gunk holing. But I don't have time to get into them now. Even as I write this, I am bobbing about in one of the finest gunk holes I have ever discovered. Its only fault is a rather noisy drive-in restaurant on the highway up above. If I have not mistaken the aroma, the specialty of the house is charred grilled hot dogs smothered in relish and heaped with chopped onions. Many persons might think the terrain between me and the drive-in totally untraversable. But what do they know about gunk holing? Blips. I seem to spend a good part of my life pushing buttons. If I want to cook a pizza, I stick it in a microwave oven, push a few buttons, and presto, I have melted cheese all over the oven. I push buttons to set the temperature of the house and car, to turn on radios, TVs, and VCRs, to type, to set my watch and clocks and the speed of my car, and even to get cash out of my bank in the rare instance when there is cash there to get. Buttons, as anglers well know, now play a big role in fishing, particularly as they apply to fish finders. Much fishing nowadays consists of pushing buttons while staring at blips on a screen. Wow, look at that one! The modern angler exclaims, staring at a blip. It's dang near an inch long. I bet that blip would go 5 pounds. Many anglers now consider a day's fishing successful if they've seen a few large blips. Soon, anglers will start mounting their biggest blips and hanging them on din walls. I tied into that blip on Lake Weegee, the angler will brag. Biggest blip ever recorded at Weegee. I've already noticed a tendency among my friends to exaggerate the size of their blips. I suspect a good deal of lying goes on about monstrous blips that got away. As my friend Keith Jackson likes to say, though you can't eat blips. As my friend Keith Jackson likes to say, though, you can't eat blips. It's not that good of a saying, but it's the best Jackson has come up with, so he says it over and over. He means that sooner or later you will have to bait a hook and dangle it down in front of whatever is causing that blip. Blip purists, of course, consider actual fishing to be bad form, crude, and distasteful. Jackson always has the latest in electronic fish finders because he does a lot of writing about high-tech fishing. After many years of scientific experimentation, he has worked out a simple and efficient method for dealing with faulty technology in fishing gear. He sells it to me. As we were visiting in his fishing tackle warehouse, formerly his garage, he said to me recently, "Hey, I got a new fish finder for you." "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing. It's the most advanced fish finder I've ever come across." "I'll bet. How much do you want for it?" "Well, you being a good buddy and all, I'm going to let you have it for for $25. $25? Let me see this worthless piece of junk. Jackson pointed to a nice wooden box, the lid of which had been nailed shut, with most of the nails bent over and surrounded by the indentations of a wildly flailed hammer. "So let me have a look at the thing," I said. "I'd prefer you take it home and look at it there," he said nervously. "No doubt," I said. Reluctantly, Jackson pried up the lid on the box. I looked in. The little high-tech face of the fish finder stared back at me. "Looks like new," I said. "It is new," Jackson said. "I only used it once." "Conked out on you, huh?" "Nope, worked fine." Well, the price is right, I said. Yep, Jackson said. A few days later, I hooked up the fish finder to my boat and went out on the lake to see if I could turn up a few blips for supper. After pushing a few buttons on the control panel of the finder without results, I resorted to an old trick I learned years ago, reading the operation manual. The manual informed me that my finder had been given its own individual name, Melvin. It said that not only did Melvin accurately report water depth, temperature, and pH and location, size, and species of fish, it also offered advice on the kind of lure to use and how to fish it. Your Melvin 500X contains a small but powerful computer into which has been fed all the fishing knowledge, lore, expertise, and wisdom of an actual 80-year-old angler. The Melvin 500X also captures much of the crusty old angler's personality, which we at Fish Tech are sure you will find amusing and entertaining. You and Melvin enjoy your fishing now, yeah? Holy cow, I said to myself. I can't believe Jackson sold me this fantastic piece of technology for only $25. He must have been out of his mind. As instructed by the manual, I punched in the secret code to activate the fish finder. Beep, 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 went the little black box, followed by, "Howdy, bub. Name's Melvin. How are you today? Well, we can't catch no fish sitting here chewing the fat. Crank up the motor and take us out to a depth of 20 feet. Don't just sit there with your thumb in your mouth. Get cracking." Hey, this is terrific, I thought. It's almost like having the old angler right here in the boat with me. I watched the depth scale on the finder screen blink toward 20 feet. "Why so quiet, bub?" the finder asked. "Cat got your tongue?" "What?" I said, startled. "You mean you can hear me?" "Sure I can hear you. Just because I'm an ugly little black box don't mean I'm deaf. Jeez craps, look out for that log. You gotta pay attention, bub. I hope you fish better than you drive a boat." Sorry, Melvin," I said. I was a little distracted there for a moment. I felt a little silly apologizing to an ugly little black box. The depth scale read 20 feet, but there were no blips on the screen. Because I was after largemouth bass blips, I decided to run on up to another spot I knew. "What do you think you're doing?" Melvin said. "We're going to fish here." "But there aren't any fish here," I said. "There's not a single blip on the screen." "Don't pay no attention to that stupid screen, bub. It don't know nothing. If I say there's bass here, there's bass here. I can feel it in my bones. Well, in my transistors, anyway. There's bass down there all right, hugging the bottom. Go about 5 pounds. Tie on a whitehead jig baited with a purple worm. Bounce it along the bottom." "I think a chartreuse worm would work better," I said. "You sesame boy! I said purple worm, I mean purple worm." I tied on a purple worm and began bouncing it along the bottom. Nothing. Melvin was beginning to get on my nerves. For one thing, he kept humming tunelessly. Presently, he said, "Knock, knock." "What?" I said. "Knock what, dummy?" Melvin snapped. "You're supposed to say, 'Who's there?'" "Stop," I shouted. "I hate knock-knock jokes." "Tough," Melvin said. "I'm supposed to entertain you, and this is the entertainment. Now I ain't going to tell you again. Knock, knock." Just then, I hooked into something and started to reel in. 5-pound largemouth, Melvin said. "I don't think so," I said. "If I say it's a 5-pound largemouth, it's a 5-pound largemouth." I hauled a waterlogged branch into the boat. "Ha!" I said, holding up the branch. "What do you say this is, Melvin?" "I say it's a 5-pound largemouth," Melvin said. I've had about enough of you, Melvin, I snarled. You sass me again, boy, I'm going to whomp your head. Okay, that's it. I'm going to jerk your power cord. A threat I instantly carried out. The screen went dark. I was left with peace and quiet, a huge expanse of sparkling water, and only my own wild guesses to tell me where the fish might be. Knock, knock, the black box said. Melvin? I said. But I pulled your plug. Ever hear of batteries, bub? I come with a backup power supply. Now, one more time. Knock, knock. I snatched up the black box. That was your last knock, knock. I'm going to deep six you. Help, help, the black box squawked. Murder, help. Melvin landed with a splash and sank. Then he bobbed back to the surface. The fish tech engineers had had the malicious foresight to equip the black box with flotation. Little paddles popped out of Melvin's side, and he started to churn his way back to the boat, causing a blue streak all the while. I pushed him off with an oar, started the motor, and headed for home, glancing back from time to time to see if I was being followed. Sure enough. Suddenly, I awoke in a cold sweat. It was the middle of the night. I was safe in my own bed. For heaven's sake, what is it? My wife, Bun, asked. Nothing, I said. I just thought I had heard something go. Knock, knock. You did, Bun said. It's at the front door. Who could it be at this hour? I think I know, I said. Don't answer it. The night the bear ate Goombaw. There was so much confusion over the incident anyway that I don't want to add to it by getting the sequences mixed up. First of all, and I remember this clearly, it was the summer after Crazy Eddie Muldoon and I had been sprung from 3rd grade at Delmore Blight Grade School. The Muldoons' only good milk cow died that summer, shortly after the weasel got in their chicken house and killed most of the laying hens. This was just before the fertilizer company Mr. Muldoon worked for went bankrupt and he lost his job. The engine on his tractor blew up a week later, so he couldn't harvest his crops, which were all pretty much dried up from the drought anyway. Then Mr. Muldoon fell in the pit trap that Crazy Eddie and I had dug to capture wild animals. Our plan was to train the wild animals and then put on shows to earn a little extra money for the family. But Mr. Muldoon fell in the trap and afterwards made us shovel all the dirt back in it. The only wild animal we had trapped was a skunk, and when Mr. Muldoon fell in on top of it, he terrified the poor creature practically to death. Neither Mr. Muldoon nor the skunk was hurt much, but the skunk managed to escape during all the excitement. So, there went our wild animal show. This occurred about midsummer, as I recall, about the time Mr. Muldoon's nerves got so bad that old Doc Hicks told him to stop drinking coffee, which apparently was what had brought on his nervous condition. For the rest of the summer, Mr. Muldoon gave off a faint, gradually fading odor of skunk, unless he got wet. Then the odor reconstituted itself to approximately its original power, which placed a major restraint on Muldoon's social life, meager as that was. Fortunately, Mr. Muldoon didn't get wet that often, mainly because of the drought that had killed off his crops. As Mrs. Muldoon was fond of saying, every cloud has a silver lining. So far, it had been a fairly typical summer for Mr. Muldoon, but he claimed to be worried about a premonition that his luck was about to turn bad. Then Eddie's grandmother, Mrs. Muldoon's mother, showed up for a visit. I knew it, Mr. Muldoon told the neighbor. I knew something like this was about to happen. I must be Physic. After I got to know Eddie's grandmother a little better, I could see why Mr. Muldoon regarded her visit as a stroke of bad luck. She immediately assumed command of the family and began to boss everyone around, including me. Nevertheless, I doubted that Mr. Muldoon was practically physic, because otherwise he would never have come up with the idea of the camping trip. I'm worried about Pa, Eddie said one morning as we sat on his back porch. He's not been himself lately. Who's he been? I asked, somewhat startled, although I regarded Mr. Muldoon as one of the oddest persons I knew. Paul's just started acting weird, that's all. You know what crazy idea he came up with this morning? He says we all gotta go on a camping trip up in the mountains and pick huckleberries. He says we can sell any extra huckleberries we get for cash. But Pa don't know anything about camping. We don't even have any camping stuff. Ain't that strange? Yeah, I said. Say, Eddie, you don't suppose your pa, I tried to think of a delicate way to phrase it. What? Eddie said. You don't suppose your pa, would let me go on the camping trip too, do ya? When Eddie put the question to his father, Mr. Muldoon tried to conceal his affection for me beneath a malevolent frown. Oh, all right, he growled at me, but no mischief. That means no knives, no hatchets, no matches, no slingshots, and no shovels. Understood? Eddie and I laughed. It was good to see his father in a humorous mood once again. I rushed home and asked my mother if I could go camping with the Muldoons. You'd be away from home for a whole week? She said. I'll have to think about that. Okay, you can go. I quickly packed my hatchet, knife, and slingshot along with edibles Mom gave me to contribute to the Muldoon grub box. The one major item I lacked was a sleeping bag. I'll just make a bedroll out of some blankets off my bed, I informed my mother. You most certainly won't, she informed me. You'll use the coat. Oh, gee, Ma, the coat's so stupid. Mr. Muldoon will tease me all during the trip if I have to use that stupid coat for a sleeping bag. The coat in question was a tattered, dog-chewed old fur of indeterminate species that my grandmother had acquired during a brief period of family wealth in the previous century. It had been given to me as a sleeping bag for my frequent but always aborted attempts at sleeping out alone in the yard. For all its hideous appearance, it was warm and cozy, and covered my 9-year-old body nicely from end to end. Still, I knew the Muldoons would laugh themselves silly when they saw me bed down in a woman's fur coat. My only hope of retaining a shred of dignity, not to mention my carefully nursed macho image, was to slip into it after they had all gone to sleep. I stuffed the coat into a gunny sack, concealing it under the one threadbare blanket my mother reluctantly issued to me. The day of the big camping trip dawned bright and clear, a common ruse of Mother Nature to lure unsuspecting souls out into the wilds. The 5 of us piled into the ancient Muldoon sedan and set off for the mountains. Most of our camping gear, such as it was, bounced precariously atop the car. It was wrapped in a huge hay tarp, which was to serve as our tent. Ain't had a drop of rain in 3 months, Mr. Muldoon had said. Probably won't need the tarp. This statement would later be recalled and admitted as evidence in the case against Mr. Muldoon's being physic. How you doing back there, Goombaw? Mr. Muldoon said to Eddie's grandmother. For some reason, everyone called her Goombaw. How you think I'm doing? Goombaw snapped back. Wedged in between these 2 sweaty young'uns, I'm boiling
wedged in between these two sweaty youngins. I'm boiling in my own juice. This camping trip is the stupidest dang fool idea you ever came up with, Herbert. We'll probably get ate by bears. Tell me, what about bears, Herbert?
Yeah, I thought. What about bears? Ha 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 ha! Mr. Muldoon laughed. You don't have to worry about bears. They're more afraid of humans than we are of them. Well, I thought, that's certainly not true of all humans, particularly one that I know personally. It's probably not true of all bears either. But I kept these thoughts to myself since Goombaw was doing a thorough job of grilling Mr. Muldoon on the subject. I could tell that the talk of bears was making Mrs. Muldoon nervous, not that she was the only one.
Let's change the subject, Goombaw, she said. Oh, all right. How about mountain lions, Herbert?
For the rest of the long, hot, dusty ride up to the huckleberry patches, Goombaw harangued Mr. Muldoon about every possible threat to our well-being, from bears to crazed woodcutters. By the time we reached our campsite, she had everyone in such a nervous state that we were almost afraid to get out of the car. Mr. Muldoon stepped out, swiveled his head about as though expecting an attack from any quarter, and then ordered us to help set up camp. No level area for our tent was immediately apparent, but Crazy Eddie and I finally located one. It was down a steep bank and on the far side of a little creek. Mr. Muldoon, Eddie, and I dragged the bundle of camp gear down the bank and across a log to the little clearing in the brush and trees. In no time at all, Mr. Muldoon had constructed a fine shelter out of the tarp. Eddie and I built a fire ring of rocks, and Mrs. Muldoon and Goombaw got a fire going and put coffee on to boil, apparently forgetting that the doctor had told Mr. Muldoon to cut down on his coffee drinking because of his nerves. Eddie and I sampled the fishing in the creek. All in all, the camping trip showed signs of becoming a pleasant experience. Then it got dark.
I say keep a fire going all night, Goombaw advised. It might help keep the bears off of us.
There ain't no bears, Mr. Muldoon said. Now stop worrying about bears. Ha! Bears are more afraid of us than we are of them. Now, everybody get a good night's sleep. We got a lot of huckleberries to pick tomorrow. He stripped down to his long underwear and burrowed into a pile of quilts and blankets Mrs. Muldoon had arranged on the ground. I pulled my threadbare blanket out of my gunny sack and spread it out in the dirt next to Goombaw.
Good heavens, Patrick, Mrs. Muldoon said. Is that all you have to sleep in? That one little blanket? The nights can get pretty chilly up here in the mountains.
Oh, I've got more blankets in my sack, I lied. If it turns cold, I'll just put some more on. But I sleep warm. As the night dragged on into its full depth, I lay there shivering in my blanket, studying with considerable interest the looming dark shapes the full moon revealed around our camp. Finally, Goombaw and the Muldoons ceased their thrashing about on the hard ground and began to emit the sounds of sleep. I jerked the fur coat out of the gunny sack and buttoned myself into its comforting warmth. I set a mental alarm to awaken me before the Muldoons so I could conceal the coat before they caught sight of the hideous thing. Then I drifted off into fitful sleep.
What's that?
Goombaw shouted in my ear. Later, she claimed only to be having a nightmare, but fortunately for us, she sounded the alarm just in time. In the silence that followed Goombaw's shout, you could almost hear 4 pairs of eyelids popping open in the dark.
A bear! Goombaw shouted. A bear's got me!
Since I was lying right next to Goombaw, this announcement aroused my curiosity no end. I tried to leap to my feet, but wrapped in the fur coat, could only manage to make it to all fours. "Bear!" screamed Crazy Eddie. "Bear's got Goo!" "Bear!" shrieked Mrs. Muldoon. "There it is!" Goomba made a horrible sound. I could make out the big round whites of her eyes fixed on me in the darkness, no doubt pleading wordlessly with me for help. But what could a small boy do against a bear? "Holy bleep!" roared Mr. Muldoon. He lunged to his feet, knocking over the ridgepole and dropping the tarp on us and the bear. Figuring Goomba all ready for a goner, and myself next on the bear's menu, I tore out from under the tarp just in time to see Mr. Muldoon trying to unstick an axe from the stump in which he had embedded it the night before. Even in the shadowy dimness of moonlight, I could see the look of surprise and horror wash over Mr. Muldoon's face as I rushed toward him for protection. He emitted a strangled cry and rushed off through the woods on legs so wobbly it looked as if his knees had come unhinged. Under the circumstances, I could only surmise that the bear was close on my heels, and I raced off after Mr. Muldoon, unable to think of anything better to do. With his abrupt departure, Mr. Muldoon had clearly let it be known that now it was every man for himself. Bounding over a log with the effortless ease that accompanies total panic, I came upon Mr. Muldoon peeling bark and limbs off a small tree. Since he was only 4 feet up the tree, I debated briefly whether to wait for him to gain altitude or to find my own tree. Then Mr. Muldoon caught sight of the bear closing fast on us. He sprang out of the tree and took off again, with me so close behind that I could have reached out and grabbed the snapping flap of his long underwear. The thought did occur to me to do so, because I was nearing exhaustion, and Mr. Muldoon could have towed me along with his underwear flap. Upon later reflection, however, I think it is well that I didn't grab the flap, for it probably would have been a source of considerable embarrassment to both of us. When I could run no more, I dropped to the ground, deciding I might as well let the bear eat me as run me to death. But the bear was gone. Perhaps he had taken a shortcut through the woods, hoping to cut me and Mr. Muldoon off at a pass. In any case, I never did get to see the bear, narrow as my escape had been. Sweltering in the fur coat, I took the thing off and stuffed it down a hollow stump, glad to be rid of the thing. When I got back to camp, everyone was gone. I climbed up to the car, inside of which I found Eddie, his mother, and Goomba, each more or less in one piece. "Thank heavens!" cried Mrs. Muldoon. "We thought the bear had got you. Have you seen Mr. Muldoon?" I said yes, I had, not mentioning that I had seen even more of him than I cared to. Half an hour later, Mr. Muldoon scrambled up the bank to the car. Upon learning that everyone was intact, he explained how he had led the bear away from the camp, at considerable risk to himself. I was surprised that he neglected to mention my role in leading the bear off, but didn't think it my place to mention it. "You gotta keep a cool head during a bear attack," Mr. Muldoon explained. "Panic, and you're done for." "Wee-wee," Goomba said. "I smell skunk. Somebody step on a skunk in the dark." Then it started to rain. Hard.